Hello YouTube, this is Peter with you once again, and this is a video response for my, frenemy, Brock Lolly. Now, Brock posted a video on The Breakfast Club as a guest host, and he submitted a question for round-robin discussion amongst the other hosts of The Breakfast Club. The question basically was, what would a divided states of America look like if you took the United States and divided it ideologically and had people of, say, right-wing persuasion in one part of the country, people of left-wing persuasion in another part of the country or other parts of the country? How would that play out? What would that look like? It's a very science fiction-y sort of question, and it comes a bit close to an idea that I've been kicking around for a story. And so it got me interested, but before he posed the question, his video was a long 10-minute preamble explaining how he thinks the United States is irrevocably divided by values, and Brock being Brock, it is, of course, all the liberals' fault. So before I go into answering his question, I want to talk about some of the things that he discussed in his long preamble. So to begin this, I'm going to show a clip which I think demonstrates how serious the situation is in Brock's view.
I think what we're facing in the United States of America is a non-bloody civil war. I really believe the country is irreconcilably divided. I don't think we share fundamentals. I don't. You know, when we speak of American values, when I hear the left speak of American values, they have no correlation with what I read in the founding, and they certainly have no correlation with what I think they are.
Now, for me, I think it's tempting to look at the United States that way, but I also think that it's looking through things through completely partisan lenses, as if the United States is people on the far right versus people on the far left. The reality is that the majority of the Americans are somewhere in the middle, and I think that has a lot to do with how your hypothetical scenario would play out. But I'm going to put that off till later when I talk about that more directly. But I think that this is Brock demonstrating the partisan lens through which he views the world. Next, I'm going to show a clip in which Brock explains why he thinks we're being divided and who he thinks is doing it.
What I truly believed happened was the powerful became more and more exposed. Their corruption became more and more exposed. The corruption that impacted all of us, from corporate corruption to government corruption, which is 6 1/2 in the other, media corruption to incest by way of power, just that runs the gamut. They realized that they were being more and more exposed, and I really truly believe that there was purposeful strategies as to how to re-inject and fan the spark. I would argue it had diminished to a spark, race relations in our nation, to divide people, to distract. I think we are being divided purposefully by way of race. Same thing with class. It was purposefully done with class. It was purposefully done with gender. All these things have legitimate problems. The body politic is dealing with legitimate problems under the tent of race, under the tent of class, under the tent of gender. I'm not dismissing them. I'm saying these things are purposefully instigated among us, purposefully fanned among us to stifle real conversation, which is virtually impossible to have now.
Now here, Brock, you seem to be indulging in conspiratorial thinking. And in fact, there's a moment in this video where you just about go full Alex Jones. Let me show that.
You have the social engineering realm. What's happening in this nation is there are social engineering elitists that truly do believe that they're Nostradamus-like in their vision of the future or vision of what humanity should be. I think it's safe to say they're willing to do anything to bring those things about. I think they'd be willing to do almost anything, including thin the herd, if you know what I mean.
Now, after a clip like that, I have to start to wonder, should I even bother to take this seriously? Should I bother responding? Because typically when people start to talk about culling the herd, I don't know how seriously I should take them. But I'm going to, against my better judgment, put that statement aside and go back to the previous clip that I played in which you talked about the elites potentially dividing us. Now, I think there is partial truth to this. Obviously, there is partisan media and partisan politics in this country. And their goal is to make it seem like what the other side is doing is the worst thing ever. And that is, of course, divisive. But part of what made me want to respond to this video is that given how partisan you are, I find a lot of this highly hypocritical. So you are someone who views the world through a very particular lens, and surprise, everything's the liberals' fault. Who's dividing America? The liberals. Who's leading to this bloodless civil war? The liberals. But it only takes a moment's reflection and a shred of intellectual honesty to see that the right not only does this, but has been doing it for decades. So, yes, there is partisan media. You have things like Fox News. When President Obama goes on vacation, how much is it costing the taxpayers? How many vacations has he taken this year? When Trump goes to Mar-a-Lago every other weekend or every weekend, who cares how much it costs the taxpayers? To the partisan, there is no such thing as hypocrisy. If the other side does it, it's the worst thing ever. If their side does it, it's fine. And so partisan media takes the news, runs it through the spin cycle of their ideology, and spits out their version of the news. I saw something recently on Facebook that I thought was very appropriate for this discussion. It was a Twitter post of a college professor saying, "Fox News tells me that I can turn all of my students into communists. Experience tells me that I can't even get them to do the readings." In the worldview of something like Fox News, the liberal indoctrination factory is being taken over by the thought police that are crushing free thought. But I propose to you that reality is different. I say that if you and I were to go on a road trip through America and pick 10 or 20 or 30 colleges and universities at random, visit those campuses and see what college is like, what the experience is like, that what we would see would more resemble Animal House than Animal Farm. But that's not the view that you get from Fox News, because their agenda is to advance one view of the situation. Yes, you can find social justice activists and gender studies departments and all these sorts of activism on college campuses, some more than others, but that's only a facet of college life. And to act like everything now has trigger warnings and safe space and they can't teach certain things is just their own fabricated version of reality to suit their ideological narrative. It's as simple as that. Now, obviously, the left engages in divisive partisan politics and hypocrisy as well. That is not something that I'm trying to deny. But again, I take umbrage with the fact that Brock seems to place all of the blame on the left, when not only is right-wing politics and media partisan, but in many ways I find the very worldview of the right to be based on division. Let me give you examples of some right-wing phrases, and let's analyze how unifying or dividing they are, all right? Traditional America, real America, Christian America, welfare queens, liberal elites, war on Christmas, culture war, and so on and so on and so on. The entire right-wing narrative and way of looking at the country is pretty well typified by what Brock said in the first clip that I played, that we are so divided by our values that we want completely different things for the country. It's as if Brock is starting out from the point of view of looking at the country as divided fundamentally, but then trying to add on top of that, in a fashion that's just redundant, the ways in which liberals divide America. Conservatives, their entire narrative is to view the United States as divided. So not only is it hypocritical to say that the left divides America in ways X, Y, and Z, but from the right-wing point of view, it seems rather redundant. As I see it, the general view of the right is that you have the good, traditional Christian Americans kind of somewhere mostly economically in the middle, and you have the extremely rich who are just living the American dream, and how dare we ask them to pay higher taxes to pay for the people at the bottom of society, the undeserving poor, the illegal immigrants, the welfare queens. And then you have above the traditional Americans, these liberal elites that sneer down at traditional America and want to take their tax money and force them to pay for the undeserving poor and the welfare queens. And they've hijacked the education system and Hollywood, and they're forcing their values down the throats of traditional America. And they have to take it back and make America great again. It's this siege mentality in which the sneering elites are forcing them to give up what they have for the people who aren't real Americans. They're not traditional Americans. They're undeserving, they're heathens, they're deviants in some way. It's this layered version of America in which the good people are beset on all sides by wicked liberals. So when someone like Brock talks about how we're being divided by race, class, sexual orientation, the liberals are using that to divide us, what he seems to mean, from the right-wing perspective, is that the left-wing is forcing them to confront issues about people whom they would otherwise regard as outside the sphere of traditional America. Race, class, sexual orientation, these are all in the other group, for the most part. So I want to segue now into a discussion about Brock's view that his childhood and teenage years were these halcyon days of harmonious race relations in America by connecting it with his view that there is some liberal elite intentionally manipulating culture so that we'll have these racial divisions. And Brock, I just don't understand why you don't make the connection to changes in technology and how movements like Black Lives Matter formed, rather than imagining that these liberal elites in some smoky room are going, how do we make race relations worse in America? So, in your little segment where you talk about how great race relations were when you were growing up, you mentioned Rodney King, and I'll come back to that in a second. But here's the thing. Rodney King was basically the first inciting incident of Black Lives Matter, because you had police abuse being documented by a video camera, and that video essentially going viral. But back in the early 90s when that event took place, video cameras were relatively rare. Nowadays, virtually everyone has a smartphone with a video camera built into it. Not only that, but they have the ability to upload that to YouTube, to Facebook, to live broadcast on Facebook, the police shooting someone in his car at a traffic stop. They can upload videos of a black man being shot in the back by a police officer as he attempts to flee, or being strangled to death by a police officer. So these sorts of dramatic videos that incite outrage can now be easily captured by virtually anyone and shared across the world. In other words, there is a much more simple and straightforward explanation than liberal elites and Obama in some smoky room deciding to stir racial hatred. Liberal elites did not create things like Black Lives Matter. The outrage generated by these videos, captured by new technology, spread by new technology, with groups organizing using this new technology, that is what has led to our current state of racial relations. But in all honesty, it's just bringing out into the open what has been happening for many, many, many decades. Which leads me to your halcyon days view of your own childhood. This is the lengthiest clip that I'm going to play, but I want to play it in its entirety to give the audience a feel of what you said.
Sadly, I might end up looking back on sort of my elementary, middle school, and then high school years as like a wonderful reprieve away of race relations. I mean, granted, I grew up in the North, and when I became an adult, I traveled to the South, and I did experience very, very real, palpable, tangible racism. But it was to say that actual racism, and what I mean by that, let me be very clear, because that word's just bandied about now. What I mean by that is a human being who hates or wishes ill, anger, ill intent, bigotry on another person simply because of the color of their skin. Let's not forget that's actually the definition of racism. I know that that word has been through the laundromat a million different ways. when I was a kid, it was profound as I reflect on it, because there was so little of that actual racism. Was there prejudices? Sure. Was there miscommunication, a lack of understanding culturally between people of all races? Yes. Was there insensitivities? Absolutely there were. But it is my firm belief that by way of the way human beings actually are, and the stuff that's just essentially baked into the cake of who we are as people, you know, there arguably was never a better time. Of course it was not blissful race relations. I mean, we had the LA riots. I mean, there was all kinds of historical problems by way of race. But I can honestly say that from, you know, my childhood to, you know, maybe arguably when I was around 18 and left my parents' home, it was as rare to see somebody openly act in a racist way towards another human being in my part of the country, in my upbringing. I'm proud, actually, to see how little of that actually happened. And I think most of you, if you're really honest with yourself, would have to say the same, allowing room for problems and so on and so forth.
Now, I played this clip in its entirety because I think it typifies a very common attitude that we see amongst white people in America today. I'm a white person who grew up in a predominantly white part of America, and I never experienced what I would define as racism, so it must have been fine everywhere. Basically, things were great, from my incredibly narrow point of view. Now, this is the point at which the so-called social justice warriors would stop and ask you, well, have you ever stopped to consider someone else's experience, what their perspective was? Because they might paint an entirely different picture. And even within the town that you grew up in, sure, they might have liked Johnny Token Black Guy just fine. But if you sat them down and you go, okay, what do you think of the inner city, the ghetto, welfare? Some of them might be completely progressive, open-minded people. Some of them might be conservative, open-minded people. But you might have seen, had the opportunity arisen, or had you asked the right questions, a different side to their opinion on race. But in white enclaves of society, these issues are often out of sight, out of mind. And they resent when the news media and social media pushes it in their face. And I can say that I grew up in an area of the United States that was something like 98% white. And there were probably about a dozen people of color in my school, and in many regards, my experience was a lot like yours. Very few people were open racists. But as I've just explained, I don't think that will tell you about how they really feel about these issues or the real state of race relations in America. The very basis of your argument is flawed because your perspective is obviously limited in quite distinct ways, and yet you seem to use that as the basis on which you view the rest of society. And when you look at things like the Rodney King riots, the LA riots as a result of the officers being acquitted for beating Rodney King, events like that don't happen because they're outraged over one single event. They happen because they're expressions of outrage over years of incidents like that. It was a boiling over of frustration, just like we saw in Baltimore. Now, that's not to justify the riots, but it's to say that it should be indicative to you that there is more going on than just the surface-level incident, that all is not as well as it might seem to you from the perspective of the white enclave of America that you grew up in. So before we finally reach the question that Brock posed, he went on another tangent about equality of opportunity versus equality of results.
I don't think that brings about equality of outcome. I do, however, think that brings about the most equality of opportunity, which I'm interested in. And I don't think my leftist brethren are interested in this. I don't think that they care about opportunity. I think they care about outcome. And I think that they care about like emotive fairness. And that's a myth. That's just a myth that's dangled like a carrot in front of us. We will never have equality of outcome. for a host of what I deem to be very obvious reasons. I mean, when you walk down the city of New York City and you see the drastic differences, tangible, fact-based, unmovable differences among humanity, of course, the outcomes would not result the same. Everything from the way we're raised, to the cultures we come from, to the mindsets that we have, to the work ethic we have, to the natural talents we have. It's just ridiculous that we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated into thinking that that's what we should be striving towards.
And so I want to address that real quickly. Brock, I think you are creating a false dichotomy, and that both the left and the right believe in equality of opportunity, but where they set that goalpost is different. And so, because you don't see the goalposts being the same place, you confuse it for equality of results. When you're talking about equality of results, before you have a result, there are many different opportunities along the way. Obviously, you cannot change every single opportunity for everyone. For example, my father didn't have millions of dollars to give me a small loan to start my real estate empire. So not everybody has that shot. On the other hand, when liberals talk about things like making state colleges tuition free, that is not equality of result. That is equality of opportunity. Because there are many bright people who can't afford to go to college, and there are many not so bright people who are in college because they can't afford it. Life is a series of opportunities, and I agree, you cannot make every opportunity equally available to everyone. I'm not tall enough to play in the NBA or talented enough about basketball to play in the NBA, period. Nothing's going to change that. But that's not really the sort of equality of opportunity that liberals strive for. However, if you really pay attention, you'll see that most liberals focus on things that we can affect. Opportunities we have some control over doing something about, like education from childhood onwards, and also things that are not necessarily easy to correct, but are still in the long run correctable, like racial bias and sexism. And just as a side note, I find it interesting that often when conservatives talk about these issues, they brush aside the notion that, say, women or people of color might be underrepresented in a certain field because of issues like bias, racial bias or sexism. They just brush that aside. But the fact that liberal professors outnumber conservative professors, clearly there's something going on there. Forget all this bias doesn't exist. Forget blaming it on personal choice. Forget not wanting equality of results. This is, the the colleges, it's out of control. Yeah. Again, it's just that partisan hypocrisy at work. But let's finally move on to the question at hand. So let's play that clip.
What's a real solution? Because I think we're just too divided. We don't want the same nation. We don't want the same things. We don't long for the same things. To say that we do is just mindfully, intellectually dishonest, in my opinion. So what do you think about carving up the nation in a geographic fashion, by way of values, by way of what we think are the solutions to the problems? The coasts are obviously, the northeast coasts are obviously very, very left-wing. Flyover state, not so much so. South, very conservative. You got this hodgepodge, you got pockets everywhere. But let's just say, for the sake of this thought experiment, that where those ideas are being implemented right now, we just say, if you want to live in a big state solution, if you want a ton of social engineering, demanding lifestyle, demanding life choices, demanding diet, demanding all this kind of stuff, you want to go pedal to the metal, green gone wild. You want to think chicken little sky is falling when the cows are flatulating. Fine, implement all that stuff. For the conservatives, the same thing goes. Religious liberty, fiscal sanity, at least what I would consider to be fiscal sanity, social conservatism, things that I actually want. Now, I realize that if the leftist was sitting here, he'd framework that very differently, but I'm not. I'm conservative. Carve that out. And where you want to live, you move. You vote with your feet, and those things play out.
All right. So how do we tackle this? First of all, because this is completely hypothetical, let's just ignore the fact that this would basically be, if it were to happen, Brexit on a shot glass of acid. The socio-political and economic ramifications are really beyond our ability to comprehend. And let's just focus on what the neo-Confederacy and the liberal bastion of the Northeast, or the coastal elitist states, the coastal liberal elitist states of America might look like. First of all, as I alluded to at the beginning of this video, I believe that most people would not be so ideologically polarized as to go for the entire conservative solution as you present it, or the big state, scary liberal solution as you present it. I think neither of those things are likely to happen unless it divided into many separate states, where there's one tiny conservative land, like Montana or something. They all go out and everybody has their little homestead in Montana, and all the super liberals can go create the new Soviet Union in Vermont or something like that, and then there's just the rest of the country that's like, so long! I don't think the United States breaks down that clearly ideologically. So assuming it was a rough split, and you get moderates on both sides, those people would keep things from going to the sorts of extremes that you're talking about. And it's interesting that you talk in terms of people wanting different things out of life, and you talk about these conservative values, but think about freedom. Freedom means different things to different people. You talk about religious liberty, but for some people, that means not having Christianity forced on them. That means women's rights to their own body, or the ability to marry someone of the same sex. That's freedom to them. And the way that I view it, many conservatives, they're fine with freedom for themselves, but freedom for other people, they somehow view as an infringement on their own freedom. So they can convince themselves that Christians are being persecuted. They're the most persecuted group in the United States. They convince themselves of these sorts of things because they're being expected to accept the freedom of others, that their values don't reign supreme, and that under certain circumstances, they can't discriminate against people on the basis of those values. And even though this would take us down the rabbit hole, in my opinion, the right-wing mentality, for all the lip service that it pays to the ideas of freedom, is often quite authoritarian in its actual outlook. But again, that's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down some other time. But since you talked about big government and its bloody history and gave your spin on that and gave your own not really thought out version, you gave the ideals of what your right-wing society would look out, but you didn't really talk about how that would actually look in practice.
So not all ideas are equal in implementation. I would argue the track record, the genocidal, body bag filling, murderous track record of big state solutions the verdict should be in on that if you read the slightest bit of history, but it isn't. I mean, as I speak to you, Venezuela is literally starving under Bernie Sanders' economic ideas, and it matters nothing to the millennials. It matters nothing to the left. But forget about that. We've debated that to the till. I'll give you an example. I'm a fiscal conservative. I think less government empowers the people. I think less allegation of resources from an elite few and more innovation, more individual decision-making. Although that's messy in and of itself, I prefer that to the other. I think that's where more prosperity is had for all. I think that's where poverty problems are best dealt with.
Let me address those things. First of all, it's sort of amazing how much the right wing is still living within the Cold War mindset, and they are completely incapable of understanding the left in anything other than the terms of the Soviet Union. Like every Democrat is a Leninist or something like that. And this is so boring and tiresome and destructive of meaningful conversation and debate. Basically, it's quite ridiculous. You mention Venezuela and the crisis that they're having and how that's Bernie Sanders' policies being implemented, and that's the consequences of it. And you say that anyone who's even briefly glanced at history will see the bloody history of big state. Well, look, Brock, I think that you only briefly looked at history. First of all, let's start with Venezuela. So something like nearly half of their economy was based on petroleum. And when prices fell, that massively devastated their economy. The United States does not have that sort of economy. It has a much more diversified economy. You can't really look to one single commodity as the crucial make or break part of the United States economy. If so, we'd be in a pretty precarious position. And honestly, what's happening in Venezuela, it is partially because of the government. And believe it or not, there is such thing as a liberal who is not just big state solution. We should have commissars and a planned economy. Yeah, I get it. That sort of thing leads to breadlines and shortages of everything. In the Soviet Union, there was a constant shortage of toilet paper, and the state newspaper Pravda sold amazingly well, and those two facts are intimately connected. I'm not going to explain how. Yes, I get that. I get why certain ideas that have been tried by so-called socialists haven't worked. But you can be for certain liberal ideas and have certain socialist ideas and not to want to go all the way with it. This all or nothing approach that you project onto the left, just stop that. Stop that for the sake of intellectual integrity. Stop that for the sake of having meaningful conversations. Stop projecting the specter of Soviet communism onto every Democrat and liberal that you meet, and you might have much more productive conversations. But since you did not go through the effort of walking through what your ideal society would look like, what your ideas in action would actually look like, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to give you my version of it, and I'm going to be as charitable to your side as you were to the left, which spoiler alert, means I'm going to depict it as a nightmarish hellscape. So first of all, I don't know if there's any sort of actual basis in history for what you're talking about, and I would say that tells us a lot about people and about history, but that's a different story. All right. So you want small government, right? Okay. So is there still going to be concentrations of wealth, like wealthy individuals and corporations, that sort of thing? And you're going to have a government that is completely ineffectual at keeping them in any sort of check. You're going to banish regulations. And so if you're poor, your wages can be at rock bottom. You have no social safety net whatsoever. You have no health regulations for the places that you live. You have no safety regulations at the job that you go to. You know, there's a clip that you played when you're talking about imagine what could happen. I want to play that clip now.
I mean, we romanticize these things now. We're awash in this post-apocalyptic entertainment stuff, and I'm as much a fan of that as anybody else. But sometimes I wonder if people have really done business with that by way of thinking about that, how horrific that would be, how children and families and neighborhoods and the downtrodden and the weak, how disproportionately they would be affected. Remind yourself that the gated community, they'll lock those gates.
Now, you talk about the gates of the gated community being slammed closed. That's pretty much what I imagine your ideal society actually playing out like. An elite living in gated communities and the wretched masses outside of those gates, who have no social safety net, who live in a polluted environment where they are exploited by their employers, who can't even be bothered to give them a safe working environment. And as it so happens, my dystopian hellscape does have a basis in history, the part of history you apparently skipped over, because before socialism, and what gave rise to socialism and communism to begin with, during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, before the Progressive Movement, when there were no regulations and the rich and companies were able to ride roughshod over workers and the environment alike, it was not a pretty picture. This is what continues to baffle me about the right, because when it comes to history, you will never fail to throw communist China, communist Russia, and all these other authoritarian states in the face of leftists. But an honest look at what unfettered capitalism looks like, they have nothing meaningful to say about. And here's the thing, in the United States, we chose a third way between the communist path that parts of Europe and later Asia went down, and South America, and the sort of unfettered capitalism that gave rise to these socialist and communist movements to begin with. We started curbing the excesses. People fought long and hard for better pay, better working conditions, to unionize, to have environmental and safety regulations, and these regulations were put in place for good reasons. Now, that's not to say that I think every regulation is good, but this right-wing mentality of all regulations bad is a simple-minded, thought-terminating cliche. And somehow we've reached a point in this country where people are applauding coal companies being allowed to dump their waste into the water system. Would you like to drink a glass of that water? I mean, honestly, Brock, there are reasons why many regulations and changes to the system were put in place. There were reasons why we developed what is now called the welfare state. It was a reaction to circumstances. And to say that if we just got rid of them, that this utopia would dawn, history doesn't support that thesis. The fact that we have the social safety nets that we have and the regulations that we have are because of the circumstances that arose that repudiate this fantastical idea of an unfettered capitalist utopia. And as a liberal, which has become this dirty word which people can just dismiss you with in this age of Trump, I'm not some Leninist. I believe in a middle way, but we've reached a point in history where we have to re-explain to people why we have social safety nets and environmental regulations, worker safety regulations, all these things, all these battles fought a century ago. It's like we have to re-explain why we have these things, because people take them for granted, but have also convinced themselves that without these things, that, you know, things would be even better, as opposed to what history actually shows us, which is that they'd be far worse. And I'm sure that now that I have taken what you said and described it in these completely dystopic terms, you've now realized that although you criticized people for not thinking through what their ideal world would look like, you didn't really explain the mechanics of how your utopia would look like, the conservative neo-Confederate states of America or whatever, and you are probably thinking of all sorts of qualifications and addendums and explanations. And again, I intentionally painted things as dark as possible because that's what you did to the left. So just paying you out in your own coin. But you mentioned in the comment section, Brock, in our little back and forth about talking about a YouTube hangout sometime. I am open to that. I've actually been planning to start doing monthly live YouTube broadcasts. I've been waiting to sort out a few technical things. Just yesterday, I had the cable guy come fix the modem because it was cutting out constantly. It would have made doing something like a live broadcast or even a, you know, like a Skype call like that virtually impossible because it would just cut out at random relatively frequently. So now that most of the technical issues have been sorted out, I will, in the near future, be doing live broadcasts. I got a whole video talking about that. But yeah, it would be cool to have you on sometime, Brock. It'd be an interesting discussion at the very least. So for my audience, have a good whatever time it is. This has been a long video, and if you've made it this far, thank you for bearing with it. Be interesting to hear from you, Brock, and have a good whatever time it is.